Hi, and welcome back to Police Stories Podcast. Thanks for listening so far. If you've heard some of our other episodes so far, and if this is your first time, then welcome. This is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force. I was on various specialist units, which we're sort of slowly working through my career from the beginning, so we'll get to some of those. But what I'm trying to do in these first few episodes is get across the variety of stuff that your everyday cop can deal with, and just some of the sort of procedures. From the comments that I've had, some people are interested in kind of how this perhaps bread and butter stuff works. And today we're going to deal with a difficult subject. Unfortunately, a lot of the subjects in the police, as you've heard, are difficult subjects. But today we're going to deal with rape. So obviously, if you've had bad experiences around this and you don't want to hear about that sort of thing, now is the time to turn it off. A little warning for you there. So there's different types of rape. In terms of legally, the law is black and white. It's very straightforward. However, the reality of rapes and the offence of rape is really, really grey. Like most other offences, but I think more so in rape than any other cases. They're all different, totally different circumstances, even if on paper they seem, straightforward. And the thing is, you have to remember that as a cop, you're trying to come at these things from a sort of evidential point of view. We're trying to get the best evidence to put before the courts to get a conviction against this person who's committed this terrible offence. But of course, the victim, has just almost certainly experienced, one of the worst events of their life. So you're trying to be, sort of a counsellor, a social worker, but also first off, a cop that's getting the best evidence. Now, years ago, I think it's fair to say the police weren't as good as they are now. Forensically, there was nowhere near the opportunities and the skills and the sort of the things available to us that are now. And I think that, the police have got a really good system for dealing with this stuff. Every force is probably different in terms of how they deal with it. Well, a little bit, but in essence, they've got, quite a good sort of procedures in place. And very early on as a cop, even as a very inexperienced cop, you'll understand what these procedures are. So you might be thinking, well, why would, a uniformed cop be going to a rape? Well, as I think I've said before, the reality is the uniformed cop almost certainly goes to everything first. It doesn't matter whether it's theft of milk from your doorstep, a rape, a murder, a horrendous, assault or a fraud involving £100,000, the street cop is going to that first, and their job is to gain that initial evidence, to get as much as they can, that package together, to then potentially pass on to more specialist colleagues, who deal with that stuff all the time. So the different forces, again, have different teams to deal with this sort of stuff. So, for example, in the Met, it's like the Sapphire team. They're the ones, and again, they might have changed their name now. But certainly when I was there, Sapphire teams dealt with the sexual offences. So as that uniform cop, you go out and you get the initial evidence as best you can. You try and preserve physical evidence, and by that I'm meaning, underwear and the scene itself. If the offence has occurred on a bed or whatever, you need to secure that. And really, you're looking to have as little physical involvement with that evidence as you can, because you touching it, picking it up, bagging it up, etc., can be transferring your own DNA and fingerprints. Now, when you first join the police, generally your DNA and fingerprints are taken, and that's for elimination purposes, because you can imagine that if they do some testing on some underwear, for example, in a sexual offence, and then they find, my DNA on it, obviously they need to be able to very quickly rule me out of it, so then they can look for the DNA of the actual suspect. And the reason I say that they're all different is, and this one today is is a fairly unusual one. I would say that stranger rapes, which is the ones that perhaps, people fear the most, and certainly, the news and the media, and telly and horror films and all the rest of it kind of, these are the ones they portray the most. Stranger rapes, woman's walking down the street, gets dragged into an alley by someone she doesn't know and is raped. That's a stranger rape. And they are incredibly rare still. Again, if you read the news and the paper, you'd perhaps feel that that's happening all the time. It just isn't. Even in the big cities, it just isn't happening. Certainly in 28 years, I think I dealt with probably 2 stranger rapes. All the rest were the ones that fit into the sort of grayer area. And by that, I mean there's a lot reported that involve kind of ex-partners. So classically, I've seen regularly where, a couple split up. Let's say it's a male and female couple, or it can be any sex couple, but they split up, they go their separate ways, and then they end up meeting up again on, a night out, going back to one of their houses, and they have consensual sex or carry out, consensual sex acts on each other, as well as, the actual act of intercourse as well. And then the following day, it can be reported as rape because, let's say this whole thing from start to finish took half an hour, and, consensual sex acts and intercourse throughout. And then 2 minutes from the end of intercourse, one of the partners basically says no. Then in terms of the law and purely in, for the offence of rape, as soon as, one of those partners says no, then the act must stop. Legally, that is what we're talking about. Now, the reality is they are very, very difficult to prosecute, and no matter how much evidence you get, because what happens is immediately those offences rule out a lot of evidence, that you've gained or could gain. So, for example, if both parties are saying, let's say that the other partner goes on to get arrested and interviewed, and they say, we used to go out, we were in a relationship, we split up, we met up again, we had sex, it was consensual. If both parties are kind of saying quite openly, yes, we had sex, but one party is saying, but right at the end I said no, and he or she carried on, then, you've got a big issue, because all forensic evidence virtually is off the cards, because it's no good you producing evidence to say, yes, I found his DNA inside her, so therefore, I can prove they had sex. No one's denying they had sex. The issue is this consent. And generally, there's only 2 parties involved, and almost certainly, or in most cases, you're in a private location, whether it's a hotel room or your own home address. So it's not like there's witnesses. It rules out witnesses. It rules out CCTV. It rules out most of forensic evidence. So what you're down to is maybe bruising, etc., on one of the parties, either where they've perhaps been held down or actually, on their genitals, which would perhaps prove force. But then again, even that doesn't necessarily prove anything, because once you get into it, the bottom line is some people have rough sex, and again, will openly admit that. And it's very easily explained away. Well, so-and-so's got a bruise on him. Yes, because we always like rough sex, and that's how it is. So how do you prove against that? And you have to remember that, don't forget, again, the police come in for a really hard time within the press, and again, you see it all on the internet and the social media that the police don't prosecute enough rapes, and they have a terrible, sort of rate of convictions in relation to rape. But you have to remember, we gather all this evidence, then we put it before the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service. I'm talking about England and Wales here. And then they decide if there's enough evidence to proceed. Now, they will only proceed if they think there is a realistic chance of conviction. So if they think the evidence is a little bit shaky, they're not too sure whether they're going to get a conviction, they'll simply say there's not enough evidence. So you're in the position, you are the one that has to then go back to the victim and say, look, I know you poured your heart out. I know, we went through all this process and we seized this stuff from you and you went through a terrible medical examination, but I'm afraid the CPS have said there's not enough evidence to prosecute. So that's the end of it. That is case closed. And unless new evidence comes to light, that won't change. So, it is unfair, although as cops, we, accept that, unfortunately, how we are seen in the press, etc., is unfair. But ultimately, it's not the police's decision now to decide whether to proceed with these cases. So the case I'll talk about today, which was a very unusual one, and what happened was I was with my sergeant, and I had, I don't know, maybe 3 years in the job, something like that. And I think I've said before that quite often the call you get to initially isn't necessarily what the call turns into. Some of my biggest, sort of most violent, most terrible jobs have started off with the most low-level sort of phone call initially, and equally the other way around. You have a call about, there's 50 people fighting with weapons, someone's been stabbed, and all this. So on the way to the call, you're geeing yourself up for this. This is going to be bad. I need to be switched on here. We've got to look out for each other. This is going to be really dangerous. And when you get there, it's absolutely nothing like the call came. Now, sometimes it's false calls. Other times it's people, well-intentioned, that's their take on what is happening in front of them. So, you very much have to deal with what you find. Anyway, so the call that we had on this day was simply from a mother saying, my daughter has been assaulted. That was it. No more on any sort of detail in any way. It didn't, she didn't let on in any way that it was sexual or anything. So perhaps in your mind, it's easy to assume. And she said that her daughter was young. I think the daughter was 16 from what I remember. So that is the age in Britain, in the UK, that you can consent to sex. So potentially, if you consent to sex at 16, in the eyes of the law, that's okay. Now, there are lots of other factors that could come in there because, if someone's drunk, they can't consent. But then, who says how drunk? So again, that's down to the police to get the evidence of drunkenness, whether that's from witnesses or CCTV, because ultimately it'll be for a jury to decide whether, they could consent or not. And also, even if you are 16 or over, if you have like mental health issues or if you have, medical conditions, you may not have the capacity to consent because unfortunately, again, we see offences like this that happen like within care homes, and maybe it's staff, there might be, terribly, there could be, special needs children within a sort of hospital setting that are then sexually assaulted or raped, and they might be 17 or 18. Doesn't mean they consent. Now you're getting into, doctors and medical professionals to give you the evidence whether they believe somebody could actually consent or not to that act, So this is what I mean. There is very, very few sort of cases of sexual offence or particularly rape that are, black and white. There's so many factors involved. And this is why, as I've said, they're so difficult to prosecute. So we go along to this address and the girl is, I'm pretty sure she was 16. And she's with her mum. Now, you can imagine, at the time I was kind of mid-20s or something like that. The sergeant I was with was probably, I think he must have been mid-30s, perhaps he was a bit older than me. But we're both males, and you're now asking a 16-year-old girl, firstly, you would have to speak to her in front of her mum or guardian. You need a parent there. Because of the age, and also because, let's face it, they're going to need some support. Now, I've been to cases like this where, the victim is in a terrible state, and is crying and is terribly upset, as you would expect, can barely form words to tell you. But I've also been to cases, and this is one of them, that they were just so matter of fact, they're just... So it's hard to picture the effect that this has had on them, which clearly it has, because obviously everyone kind of displays emotions in a different way. Just because, she's not falling about, screaming and crying and banging her fists on the table, doesn't mean she's terribly affected by it. But in this case, she was very, very matter of fact. She was a bit embarrassed, and and this is where it's difficult. We quite often would try and send a female officer in this case, but it's just not always possible. So unfortunately, she had, kind of me at 25, my sergeant at, kind of 35, two men turning up to ask her the most intimate details, and potentially, the sort of most terrible things I said that's happened to her in her life. Her mum was there as well, and sometimes that could be an issue because obviously perhaps the victim would feel more comfortable in talking to cops, whether it's male or female, without their parent present, because again, it's even more embarrassing to go into, really sort of, great details about, sort of sexual activity with your mum or dad sat there. You can imagine that's very difficult. But on this occasion, mum was there. And the victim was, willing to speak to us and was actually, pretty open. And like I say, didn't seem on the surface that affected, and also was happy to discuss things in front of mum. So we set about getting the initial details. Now, again, remember the plan here for a cop is to get the basic details, which you may be noting down either in a notebook or in these days, a PDA, or like you might have an iPad or a laptop. A lot of the forces now are issuing those. So you might be taking some rough notes. This won't be a formal official statement. This will probably be rough notes that will go to evidence, because the actual statement will be taken by a very specialist officer who has extra training in interviews, particularly of victims of sexual offences. And quite often, if they're young, it's video kind of interviews or statements that are done. So rather than stuff being written down in a stuffy old room with two blokes, it's someone who's much better trained than I was, that would sit in a comfier room with sofas that tries to put them at ease a little bit more. And the evidence is filmed, it's on video, and therefore they don't have to kind of keep stop-starting to say, sorry, can you just spell that? You let them flow with the information. You don't want to cut them off when they're in full flow, because obviously you can imagine that perhaps in some cases they're barely able to talk about this stuff. So for you to then stop them, is difficult, and not conducive to getting the best evidence. And like I say, you have to remember, there's this dual thing, you're trying to desperately be sympathetic to them, but also get the information out. And you have to ask some really difficult questions, even on that initial, gathering of the evidence. So in this scenario, the girl told me, I said, well, look, just talk us through what's happened, So she said, okay, I'd been down at a friend's house, and there was a guy I knew. Now, she didn't say anything more than that about this person. She just said initially there was a guy I knew. And basically, my friend, we were in my friend's bedroom. We were listening to some music. It was all fairly innocent at this point, just chatting, listening to music. So there was the victim, there was her friend who was female, and then there was the suspect who was a young male. And she said they'd been in there for like half an hour chatting. And then eventually the friend left. I think the friend had to go out to pick up a little brother or something like that, but basically left the victim and this male alone in the bedroom. So over the next kind of, half an hour or so, basically he kind of literally forced himself onto her. It didn't sound like there was an awful lot of consent going on, but you have to really break it down, into saying, so at any point. Now, the thing is, let's face it, very few people, during sort of sexual intercourse or, sexual activity, sort of pull out a formal written contract and say, right, sign here to say that you are consenting, or, because when you're saying, and did you consent to that? Were you happy with what was happening? Did you say no at any point? But you've got to be very careful you don't put words into their mouth. So, but then sometimes when you say to someone a nice open question, tell me what happened, they go, well, he raped me. And obviously people understand rape as being different things as well. You can't. So a lot of the time I've been to cases where people say, well, this guy raped me. And you go, okay, well, what happened? Well, he touched my backside through my skirt, so he raped me. And you sort of go, okay, but so what happened then? And they go, well, that was it. He grabbed my backside through my skirt. So he raped me, and you have to, you've got to very delicately sort of explain that, look, what he's done is a sexual offence, definitely, but just so you know, kind of, it's not rape, but in no way, you know, you kind of, you can't belittle what they're telling you, because again, that could have been a bad experience. I mean, it's really, really difficult ground to tread, you know, and I'm not saying I always get it right, you know, or got it right, and neither do a lot of cops, you know. So we had to break it down to this guy. So just talk me through exactly what happened. Now, remember, you know, two blokes in front of her mum. She's 16, but she goes on to describe that basically, you know, he's kind of laid her down on the bed and he's removed her underwear, you know, and he has penetrated her with his penis, which, you know, and she didn't consent. She said she was terrified, you know, and she's basically laid there, you know, completely, you know, stiff and rigid, you know, too afraid to move, which is a classic you'll hear, because again, when people are sort of saying, you know, oh, that's not rape, you know, because they didn't fight back, the reality is a lot of people are so frightened, you know, of what's going to happen. They're convinced they're going to be killed if they fight back in any way. So they literally just lay there and let it happen. Doesn't mean they consented, it means they're terrified, you know. So as I say, there's so much to these offences. But basically, her underwear had been removed. She'd 100% been raped from what she described to me. And then basically, you know, she sort of pulled up her underwear. She'd not fought back at all, but we've already just talked about kind of why that might be. And then basically this guy left. So I think this was like a weekend. It was like Saturday or something that this had happened. I think this had happened on sort of a Tuesday, and it was Saturday that I was sort of speaking to her. So it was kind of 4 or 5 days before. So I said, okay, right, you know, and that's, you know, the whole incident. Have you ever seen him again, you know? And she said, oh yeah, I've seen him again. I saw him, you know, that was like the Tuesday. I saw him again on kind of Thursday or Friday, you know. I said, oh, right. So what happened then? Well, the same thing. And basically she went on to describe that exactly the same thing had happened. So it actually happened twice. So I was like, wow, you know, I kind of didn't expect that at all. So took down as many details as I could at the time. It was, you know, pen and paper, made as many notes as I could. And then you have to get on to the sensitive subject of, firstly, so where did this happen? Because there's definitely a scene out there somewhere that I need to try and preserve. But obviously, if this has happened 5 or 6 days before, then, you know, obviously the bedding may have been washed. This has happened in a friend's house, so a friend might be completely oblivious to anything, you know, because I don't think she'd actually, if I remember, she hadn't told her friend what had happened. So there's every chance, you know, the sort of scene, if you like, has been completely destroyed forensically. So, and then the difficult question about what clothing she was wearing, you know, so what clothing were you wearing? She said, well, you know, this red top and, you know, this pair of trousers or this skirt or whatever it was, but particularly the underwear, you know, that's what I'm really interested in, because obviously that could have the key forensic evidence on it, that, you know, that will get us the conviction if the defence of consent isn't used, which, as I say, we are seeing more and more often now. So she pointed out the clothes that she had been wearing during the time of the offence, and they were seized by us. Now, again, when you seize evidence of a sexual offence, or in fact generally any offence now, rather, they don't go into plastic bags, they go into paper bags. And the reason for that is that plastic bags sweat. You know, if I seal, you know, some underwear in a plastic bag and then go and put it in a property store, you know, within the police station, which is either particularly warm or cold, condensation can form, and actually the dampness within that bag can obviously ruin the evidence. So, you know, kind of police got wise to this years and years ago. So even when I joined, you know, 30 odd years ago, we were using paper bags, because paper bags allow these things to breathe. They preserve the evidence, but they don't allow the evidence to be destroyed. But even the paper bag has a specific way that it has to be sealed up to give it integrity. So, you know, a paper bag is folded over twice at the top. It has sellotape goes all around it at the top, so you cannot break that seal unless you unless it's very obvious, you know. And on the bag will be an evidence label, And there's an opportunity, because obviously when it's forensically examined, there is an opportunity for the scientists to take that out. But they have to break the seal and then sign that bag to say they are the ones that broke that seal, and these things have to marry up to preserve that evidence and the continuity of that evidence and to make sure that it's still usable in law. So having taped it round a couple of times around the top of that twice folded over bag, you would then put an exhibit label or a label right across the actual folded bag, which you then sign. So again, there's absolutely no way that seal can be broken without it being obvious and having to be resealed once it's been signed. So we see some of the clothing, and we checked obviously whether it had been washed or not, because even washed clothing could still be useful from a DNA point of view. So some of the clothing was seized, but she hadn't mentioned her underwear at all. And I said, look, I know this is difficult, but I have to ask, what underwear were you wearing during the time? And she said, well, actually, I've got it on. And I kind of looked at Mum and I said, oh, I see, right, okay. So obviously it's been washed, maybe more than once since that happened. And she looked at me kind of quizzically and was like, no, it's not been washed. And I said, okay, right. So that was the first offence on a Tuesday. Just to clarify, the underwear you were wearing during that offence on Tuesday hasn't been washed. And she confirmed, no, it hasn't, and I've got it on. I went, right, okay. And I said, so I have to ask, on the later offence, I think it was the Thursday or the couple of days later when it had happened again, where's the evidence? Where's the underwear for that offence? Were you wearing a different set of underwear then for that? She was like, no. That was the same underwear. I still had it on. So my mind is, kind of processing this at this point. So I said, right, just to clarify, you were raped on Tuesday and on, let's say, Thursday, a couple of days later, and the underwear you were wearing at the time of both those offences, you've still got on now on Saturday, and it hasn't been washed. And I said, this is really important, from an evidential point of view. And she 100%, confirmed that along with her mum. Yeah, that's right, Now, it's not for me to judge in relation to, cleanliness or washing of clothes or whatever, but needless to say, I was a little surprised. So anyway, that underwear obviously had to be seized as well. But there's a process then. So what happens was she was then subsequently taken into a specialist suite that we had at the police station, and then the more the sort of better trained interview officers came in and did the formal interview, and she was also then subject to, and it's not very pleasant, a full sort of forensic examination, which is very unpleasant, and various swabs are taken from different locations on her body, but that is absolutely vital to secure the evidence. Anyway, I'm jumping slightly ahead there. If I just come back a little bit, so we've seized this stuff, we've established where the offence has happened and what's happened. And at this point, obviously, we're now trying to get the details of this guy. So she said to me, or I said, so do you know this guy's name at all? Or obviously we need to get a description or try and find out where he lives or anything about him, because this is where, the evidence comes in. Ultimately, we want to catch this guy. And she said, oh, yeah. And now this is the first time she's mentioned it. She said, oh, yeah, I know him really well. He's my brother. So I said, right, okay, so the guy that we're talking about that's raped you twice is your brother. I said, now, bearing in mind, some people call, close friends brothers, so it doesn't necessarily mean siblings, blood relatives. So again, there was a certain amount of clarification, but 100% that was the case. This was her blood brother that had carried out these two rapes. Well, actually, now that's a different offence. That's incest, and is incredibly rare, thankfully. But Mum was there as well, and she confirmed it. Oh, absolutely, yeah, that's my son. He doesn't live with us, and he's a bit older. I think he was like, 19 or 20. But she'd been raped twice by her brother and was just sitting there, matter of fact, talking about it like she was saying she'd popped out, to the shop for some milk, But in no way does that take away what the offence was. But I must admit, even I was a little shocked at this. And then while we're literally just finishing up this conversation and we're about to take her onwards to what I've just talked about, this specialist suite and all the rest of it, she sort of points out the window and go, oh, there he is now. And again, I was kind of taken aback. So just to clarify, your brother that raped you twice, that's him outside now. And she's like, yes, that's right. So I kind of looked at my sergeant. We couldn't believe what we're hearing. Like, right, okay, you stay here. So we go running outside, get hands on this guy, and we arrest him for incest. Now, I just, my mind was boggled by all this, and I just couldn't believe that what I was hearing really all round. Now, in an ideal world, it wouldn't have been us doing the arresting because you've got all sorts of cross-contamination issues here with DNA. I've just seized, admittedly with gloves on, her underwear and put it in a bag, which we're trying to prove DNA, and now I'm going out to lay hands on him. So straight away, you can imagine a prosecution solicitor is going to say to me, and I put it to you, officer, when you went back into that address, you then picked up that underwear in the bag with those same hands that you've touched the suspect on. So, of course, my client's DNA is on that underwear because you put it there. So cross-contamination is something you have to be really careful about, especially if you've got multiple offences and maybe the same cops arresting people as well that have been to a scene or that have touched vital evidence. But it's something the police is very aware of. So anyway, that wasn't the case because actually we had no more to deal with it, and already those bags had been sealed. So it was watertight, the evidence. And that's what happened. The case went through, and sure enough, he got convicted of 2 counts of incest and got a long prison sentence. But, very, very unusual. The only time I've ever dealt with it, and the only time, I can't remember hearing about it, of any colleagues dealing with it in another occasion, but it was an absolute black and white offence. Having told you there's very few of those, and a really, really difficult one to process for me personally, and possibly you're sitting there as well, kind of aghast at that offence. But yeah, there we go. So an interesting one to say the least. So that's episode 21 for you. You might be sitting there in shock, I don't know, but hopefully you'll come back. The incidents will vary, as I dealt with them throughout my career, as you'll hear. Thanks for the downloads. Like I say, I've been going really well. I'm very pleased with that, and that we're available on all the various different podcast type platforms. Just search for Police Stories Podcast and you'll come up with it. Thanks very much for listening. Take it easy. I'll speak to you again soon. Cheers.